On my 29th birthday, my parents walked into my apartment without knocking and dropped a folder on my table like it was the bill for my existence. My father laughed first, the soft, satisfied kind that fills a room faster than smoke. My mother didn't bother to sit. She just tapped the folder and said my sister's future was now secured. They never noticed the candle on the cake behind them burning itself out. I didn't argue. I didn't even ask why. I only asked one question in my head. How long until they realized what they took wasn't mine to lose? I learned early that silence was easier than asking for anything. Growing up, our house always sounded like someone else's life. My sister Grace's piano lessons echoing down the hallway, my mother cheering from the kitchen, my father's voice booming with plans made for her, never with her. I moved around that noise like a shadow, careful not to interrupt the music of their expectations. Money was the first thing they took without asking. I was 17 when my father borrowed the savings from my part-time job. He stood at the doorway, jingling his keys, saying it was for something important. He never told me what. My mother told me not to be dramatic, that families shared everything. Grace got a new dress that week. I figured out the math on my own. By 20, I'd learned to keep my victories small. When I got my first certification in data security, my father skimmed the paper and asked if I could fix his password problems instead. My mother changed the subject to Grace's internship. At dinner that night, only one story mattered, and it wasn't mine. So I worked. Quietly, consistently. Every extra hour I stayed at the office, every freelance job I picked up every weekend, I said no to invitations. I funneled it all into a savings account the way some people write diaries. Numbers became my timeline. My 20s passed inside spreadsheets no one else would ever read. I lived in a cheap studio then. The walls were thin, the heater rattled, and I had to tape the window frame in winter so the wind wouldn't whistle through. Still, every month I transferred what I could, $100, $300, sometimes $1,000 when a bonus came through. I'd watch the balance rise slowly like water filling a cracked glass, never fast, never clean, but steady. The misleading part was how proud I felt. Not because of the money itself, but because it was mine. Something untouched. Something no one had rewritten or redirected to Grace. I carried that account like a secret proof that I wasn't entirely invisible. But each year, my family found new ways to remind me where I stood. Grace's graduation party lasted a week. Mine ended before the cake melted. At her first job celebration, relatives toasted to her bright future. When I earned a promotion, my father handed me a list of bills he needed me to cover just this month. My mother smiled in that soft, pitying way and said I didn't mind helping. Everyone nodded, assuming generosity was my personality instead of my only choice. The worst moment came 6 years ago. I had just finished a major project, the kind that changes careers. I walked into my parents' living room expecting, even hoping for a small acknowledgement. Instead, they were already mid-conversation about Grace's newest idea. I stood there holding my folder like a guest who'd arrived at the wrong house. That was the day I learned my place in this family. Not the star. Not even the supporting role. Just the resource they'd forgotten could run out. My father pushed the folder across my kitchen table like he was delivering paperwork I had already agreed to. The edges were worn as if someone had handled it many times before bringing it to me. My mother didn't sit. She drifted behind him, arms folded, eyes scanning the apartment the way people inspect a hotel room they don't plan to stay in long. I opened the folder because staying still was the only thing I trusted myself to do. The first page was a withdrawal confirmation. The number at the bottom didn't make sense at first. My brain refused to attach meaning to something so clean, so absolute. $2,900,000. 10 years of extra hours, skipped holidays, saved bonuses, paychecks divided into careful portions, all gone in a single signature. My father let out a short laugh, the kind he used whenever he talked about winning. "Thanks," he said, tapping the page with one finger. "Your money secured your sister's future." The room went quiet enough for the fridge hum to grow loud. My mother adjusted the sleeve of her blouse. "You would have wasted it anyway," she said, not cruel, not angry, just certain. Something inside me stopped, not a feeling, not a thought, but a movement. A pause. The kind that happens when a person finally sees the truth without its excuses. Grace wasn't there, but I could hear her name in every word they said. Her future, her needs, her world. Mine wasn't mentioned. Not once. I felt my hand hovering above the folder, frozen in a half step toward something that no longer existed. I lowered it slowly, the way someone might set down an object that isn't theirs. They kept talking. Plans, timelines, a renovation Grace wanted for her business, a thank you dinner they assumed I'd attend. Each word floated past me like I was just the wall absorbing their voices. I didn't argue. I didn't ask why. Those were habits from a version of me they had trained too well. Instead, I let the silence sit between us, heavy, deliberate, unmistakable. Then I did the one thing they never expected. I laughed too. Not loudly, not mockingly. Just a quiet exhale shaped into a sound they mistook for surrender. But it wasn't surrender. It was the moment I stopped pretending they were ever going to see me. I laughed because what they took wasn't my real savings. The folder they dropped on my table held numbers they believed belonged to me. And technically, they had, for a while. Long enough for them to trust the balance to assume it was the only account I had, long enough for confidence to make them careless. They thought they understood everything about how I lived, practical, quiet, predictable. They never understood the way I prepared. 3 years earlier, on a late night in my office, I created a parallel structure, a decoy account that mirrored my real savings and pattern, only deposits at consistent intervals, amounts reasonable enough to pass as authentic transfers in a cadence identical to the way I'd built my life. But its purpose was never to be spent. It existed to be touched by the wrong hands. On the morning after my birthday, the apartment was silent again. The folder sat exactly where my father had pushed it, its corner slightly bent from where my thumb had rested. I made coffee, watched the steam rise, and set the mug beside my laptop. It was a small ritual, the kind that steadies a room. I opened my logs. Every transfer ever made to the decoy account was organized in a spreadsheet with timestamps, notations, and a color-coded column for expected behavior. I had mapped the exact moment when a suspicious withdrawal would trigger a fraud alert from the system I'd helped design years before. The flags were already active. The moment they'd accessed that money, the algorithm would start its quiet work. The real savings, untouched, lived somewhere else entirely. I scrolled through the audit trail. I'd built the replication of deposit patterns, the mirrored balances, the deliberate absence of any personal bills or payments that would tie the account to my daily life. It was clean, suspiciously clean. And that was the point. My parents had taken something that looked like a life's worth of work, not knowing it had been engineered for exactly this. I sent a single text to my lawyer. They accessed the flagged account. A moment later, proceed. No explanation, no lecture, no outrage. We had rehearsed this exact line months ago. My lawyer had always told me that some truths didn't need to be said out loud. They just needed documentation. I closed the messages and opened another folder labeled quietly in my computer records. Inside were statements, payments, transfers, copies of emails, and snapshots of balances from the last decade. Everything I'd ever put away for myself was detailed in clean rows. I added the newest screenshot, the decoy account balance, at 0. For a moment, the cursor blinked in the middle of an empty cell, a small pulse of light. I exhaled slowly and shut the window. The next action was simpler than I'd imagined. I opened my banking app and removed my parents from every auto payment they'd asked me to temporarily cover over the years. I had kept them going out of habit, not loyalty. One by one, I canceled the scheduled payments, insurance, utilities, a monthly contribution they insisted was for family emergencies. Each cancellation made a soft clicking sound. It was the quietest boundary I had ever drawn. I opened my notebook and wrote a list, not of what they owed me, but of what I no longer owed them. The list was short, shorter than I expected. I crossed the last line with a single stroke of my pen. At work, the office lights were their usual fluorescent white flat and steady. Noah passed by my desk that afternoon, balancing his lunch and a stack of reports. He glanced at me, then at my screen, then offered a quiet nod as if sensing something in my posture that hadn't been there before. I returned the nod, nothing more. I spent the rest of the day reviewing a proposal for an upcoming contract, double-checking encryption requirements and access flows. My focus felt sharp, almost unnaturally so. When the office quieted toward evening, I leaned back in my chair and opened a folder of personal notes I'd been keeping for years, ideas for my own project strategies I'd never shown my parents because they would have dismissed them as unrealistic. I reread every line, not with longing, but with clarity. At home that night, I poured a glass of wine and sat at my dining table. The folder they had brought still lay nearby. I didn't touch it. Instead, I opened my real savings account and looked at the balance steady and whole, untouched by anyone but me. I let the numbers settle into my chest like an anchor. I took another sip of wine and flipped through my documents one more time. The flagged account logs, the audit triggers, the index of inconsistencies their withdrawals would inevitably present to compliance officers. Everything was unfolding exactly the way it had been designed to. There was no rage inside me, no trembling, just a stillness carved from years of being underestimated. My parents had taught me the cost of silence. I had simply learned to use it differently. I closed the folder gently, my fingertips leaving no sound on the cover. The candle from yesterday's cake sat on the counter, a small piece of wax bent to one side. I picked it up, examined its shape, and set it down again. This time, I wouldn't fix what they'd broken. The first alert came while I was pouring my morning coffee. A soft vibration on the counter, the screen lighting up with a notification from the bank. Unusual activity detected. I stared at it for a moment, the steam from my cup brushing my face as if reminding me to breathe. Then my phone rang. My father's number. His voice exploded the moment I answered. "What did you do, Ruby?" "The bank froze everything. Every account. They're saying there's an investigation." I leaned against the counter, watching sunlight crawl across the floor. "I got an alert too," I said quietly. "Seems like a fraud check." "Don't play games with me," he barked. "They think we laundered money. They're reviewing transfers. They're asking questions about patterns." Patterns. The exact thing I'd built the trap around. Before I could respond, my mother's voice bled through the speaker, high and frantic. "Fix this, Ruby. You're ruining our reputation." Grace is in tears. "Your father can't breathe." I raised the cup to my lips. "You mean the future my money supposedly secured?" The silence that followed felt like a door finally closing. I ended the call and opened my email. Another alert, this one from a federal compliance office. Account flagged. Under review. Not mine, my parents'. Then another update, this time from my lawyer. They triggered the full audit. Stand by. Everything moved in clean lines after that, like dominoes falling in the order they'd been placed years before. By midday, my parents had called 8 times. Grace, twice. I didn't answer any of them. Instead, I reviewed a contract draft at my desk, redlining sections that needed clarification. My pen felt steady, my heartbeat calm. That evening, the news ran a short segment. Local couple under investigation for suspected financial misconduct. The camera caught my parents outside their home, my father arguing with someone off frame, my mother shielding her face from the reporter's questions. Their expressions were a mirror image of the arrogance they'd worn in my apartment. Only now the confidence was gone. I watched the screen in silence, letting their voices fade into background noise. The room felt still lit only by the glow of the TV. The next morning brought escalation. A hard knock rattled my apartment door, urgent, uneven. I opened it to find my mother standing there, hair unbrushed, perfume mixed with panic. She pushed past me before I said a word. "Ruby, listen to me," she said, pacing like a trapped animal. "Investigators came to the house. They asked about wire transfers, missing statements. Your father almost passed out. This can't be happening, not to us." I leaned against the counter, the same place I'd stood when they told me they'd taken everything. My voice stayed even. "I told you not to touch what wasn't yours." She froze. "We're your parents. Everything we did was for the family." "For Grace," I corrected. Her eyes glistened, but tears didn't soften her tone. "You set us up." "No," I said. "You walked into a system you didn't understand. And you assumed I wouldn't understand it either." Her shoulders sagged. "Please, help us." I didn't respond. There was nothing left to negotiate. The following day, the full turn happened. Emails, letters, a formal notice confirming the audit, and then the message from my lawyer that settled everything. They accessed the flagged account. The investigation is proceeding exactly as expected. I stepped onto my balcony, letting the warm air wash over my face. Below, the city hummed with its usual indifference. Behind me, the TV replayed the news segment. My parents' voices echoed faintly through the glass. They hadn't just stolen from me. They'd walked straight into a trap I'd set for them years ago, and all I had done was stop saving them from themselves. The rain started that evening, a soft curtain against the balcony railings, quiet enough that I could hear each drop land. I stepped outside with a mug warming my hands, the city blurred behind the mist. The air smelled faintly of wet concrete, the kind of scent that makes everything feel newly washed. Inside, my phone buzzed with updates, articles, messages, inquiries. I let them sit. The world could move on without me for once. On the table beside me lay a photograph my father had mailed months earlier, the three of us at a beach, sunlight hitting our faces unevenly, my younger self perched on his shoulders. I lifted the picture, tracing the edge where the paper had softened over time. It felt like holding a story that no longer belonged to me. Work had been steady that week. I'd signed 2 new contracts, answered questions in meetings where my opinions mattered, and walked through hallways without feeling like a placeholder. Noah had passed by my desk that afternoon, offering a small smile without asking anything. It was enough. A letter waited inside my mailbox, Grace's handwriting uneven and unfamiliar. She wrote that she'd enrolled in a program for women rebuilding their finances, that she understood if I didn't want to reply. There was no accusation, only a quiet acknowledgement of everything she hadn't seen until now. I set her letter beside the old photograph and watched the rain streak down the balcony glass. Later, I drove to the coast. The same stretch of sand from the photo, the same tide pulling in and out. I stood where the waves could reach my feet and felt the water wrap briefly around my ankles before letting go. "I forgive you," I whispered into the wind. "Not for them, for me." Some boundaries aren't spoken. They're drawn the moment you stop returning to the places that taught you to shrink. My family once believed I would carry their mistakes forever, that silence meant obedience instead of understanding. But the truth was simple. I didn't break the cycle. I just stepped out of it. The ocean behind me moved in quiet rhythms, steady, unbothered. I took one last breath of salt air and walked back toward my car, leaving the past where it finally belonged. If you want more stories told in this quiet kind of truth, stay for the next one.